Thank you, Aziz, for the presentation and the very kind words. Let me say a few things about first of all, about I would like to interact with you. So at any point, if you want to ask a question, don't hesitate. If time runs too quickly or if the question it will take too much time to answer, I would say I will answer at the end, but I will welcome questions. If I tend to get excited, when I give a talk, I tend to actually leave us sometimes. So if I say something too quickly and you want me to explain something further, do so, please. The company, the C that you see here stands for Cyprus, because as you see, this is it comes from a laboratory with the same name that I ran at Riken for 12 years. And for consistency, I asked Riken if I can continue the same name, so the continuity is evident. And I will actually mention a little bit about the history of the work. The title I gave was a purely role of neurofeedback, starting with neurofeedback, intending to emphasize neurofeedback. But then as I was putting the talk together, I decided to leave neurofeedback not out completely, but not to emphasize it, because otherwise it would become too convoluted. And of course, any questions that you may have about that part, I would be happy to answer at the end. So I propose leaving the neurofeedback out. So I'm going to talk about the canonical remorting of the neurorepresentation of self during sleep. That's an idea which dawns slowly on me based on the results that I analyzed and data from sleep quality for the first experiment. I would like to give you the history of why I decided to do the first experiment in the new laboratory I set up in Japan, why I chose that, because I think it's an interesting example. So I will start with an introduction talking about all the data that produced these results are obtained from MEG from the Laboratory of Human Brain Dynamics, J from Japan. And therefore, I will start by just saying a little bit about MEG, just to make the statement why it's such a wonderful technique and why it allows us to take the results and arrive at something new. And then I would like to say how when I went to Japan for the first time and I was choosing one subject to emphasize, I chose sleep. It's because of reading the book by Michel Jouvet, The Paradox of Sleep, which inspired me to actually do that. And I'll try to explain that. Most of the talk will be based on the history of sleep, because in order to understand what is new, you have to understand, say something about what is sleep itself. And in my view, now we are in the process of having a second revolution in sleep research because of the results that I'm about to describe. So the new understanding of sleep, which comes out of that, is an explanation of the very big question that was in everybody's mind from thousands of years, but only in the last century we began to actually address, namely, what is the role of sleep? Sleep is a very strange entity, and I will finish at the end with saying something about the neurorepresentation of self, how that relates to disorders, and a little bit about neurofeedback right at the end. And I'll leave the open questions and future plans rather than listing them for you to actually say something at the end and ask questions. So, magnetoencephalography, or MEC for short, is the study of measuring and interpreting the magnetic field that the head is generated. What I want to emphasize is that when you have an activity inside the brain, an electrical activity inside the brain, it generates an electric and magnetic field. The electric field gives you the EEG, the more familiar electroencephalogram, but the magnetic measurement, it gives you the magnetic field. You have coils outside the head, bathed into a liquid helium container at 4 degrees above Kelvin, just a few centimeters above your head. It's an amazing thing, but it works. And it's fantastic. Because of the cryogenics, though, this is a little bit cumbersome, not easy to put in a hospital, definitely not easy to move around with it. There is a revolution in MEG with the solid state systems that are coming up. We are not there yet, but just before here, I visited the Nottingham University and had a talk with the people there, some of the amazing things. And I believe that with the new solid state instruments that are bound to become the mode over the next few years, that would be one of the key medical equipment for medicine for the 21st century. Why? Because you have a signal which travels with the speed of light. So when you have this activity at the center, the signal arrives at the same time in all the sensors. So you have an instantaneous measure of the change in the magnetic field. So any change in the electrical activity generates that, and you're able to see it immediately. And you're able to sample it 1,000 times or 10,000 times a second if you want. Nobody does that anymore, but I think there would be a reason for people to do it, but that's another talk. The difficulty is not measuring the signal. That's now it can be done quite routinely with this instrument. The difficulty is how to separate this minute magnetic field that you generate with super quantum interference devices with quantum effect minute signal, many millions of times smaller than that of Earth, from all the external noise. If a car goes a mile away, it will generate a lot stronger signal. Even if somebody uses the lift in the same building, it will generate a huge signal. Amazingly, I don't have the slide here, but when I went to Riken and I was about to choose, and here you have to choose from in this place where you want to put your laboratory. And I said, yes, but the fMRI is next door. The 4 Tesla machine is going to be next door. They said, yes. I said, can you move it out mile away? He said, no, it has to be here. And the arrogance of man, we had the system which produces some of the strongest magnetic field on Earth right next door with the system that actually measures some of the smallest magnetic field you can measure. But we could do it. It could be done. This technique, I think, was required. So magnetoencephalography deals with the detection and interpretation of the minute magnetic field generated by the brain, the signal detected by very sophisticated and expensive equipment. You measure mostly external noise unless you are in a shielded room, and you do all sorts of things to eliminate distant sources which are not of interest. A lot of activity then the activity that remains comes from the body and the brain. And some of it is of interest to you, depending on what you want to study. Other of it is of no interest. For example, the heart is of no interest to most of the things we do. But for what I'm going to talk about today, it's very important, very, very relevant. The question is, what do you do after you have the signal? Historically, we had a single channel system, then 7-channel system, then something which covered over one hemisphere, then both hemispheres, and then the helmets. So historically, we used to analyze by looking at one side of the head, you have a cylinder source space, inside of which you actually could reconstruct. There are technical advantages why this is a good idea to do even when you have a helmet system. And I will talk about it if anybody has questions, anybody to talk to. That's a separate lecture. Mathematically, it makes sense to do that because it makes the reconstructions much more stable, much more robust. So the method which it developed in 1989, using this a number of source spaces, left, right, front, back, and top of the head, and then combining together the results, produces an accurate representation of the electrical currents in the brain instantaneously. With millisecond by millisecond accuracy, we do millisecond by millisecond tomography, which offers coverage of the entire brain, cerebellum, and brainstem. And for sleep, it's important to cover all those. I will give you some examples to convince you that this can be done with the techniques of magnetic field tomography, but I will not. This is not the subject of the talk. But if you have any specific questions about that, I will be happy to answer questions. So at the end of the day, you are left with a hell of a lot of data covering every millisecond. For every millisecond of measurement, you have a tomographic solution, and you do all the statistics in those data in the source space if you want. Okay, so a lot of the results you're going to see, and we've been glossed over the results. They are not statistical analysis where you average the signal and you compare the average of one condition with another. You're actually having millisecond by millisecond tomographic activity, which you then statistically, you ask questions about what's happening in the brain, what's happening, for example, in one area when you delay the signal from another, time-delayed mutual information to look at the interaction between the two, which I would not talk very much, but again, if you are interested, I have some results which I can show. Now, historically, as Vasily said, I started in nuclear physics, and then I wanted to go out of nuclear physics, and I wanted for a field to go into, and I was sharing a room with a colleague who was studying the static currents from the legs. And he was modeling that as two infinite wires. And I said to him, why do you make such a model? In the leg, you have a finite body there. Why do you want to have this ridiculous model? He said, because there is no unique solution. I was working on the inverse scattering problem in nuclear physics, which also had no unique solution. So I said to him, give me the math. He gave me the math, constructed the current loop model. We can actually take an ellipsoidal loop and then allow it by iteration to go through and have a figure of 8 kind of path. That was nice, interesting, but legs are not so interesting. So I looked around, what else could you study with that? And I realized back in the 1988 that we could, in theory, see what's happening inside the brain. And it was a technique which might have had the spatial resolution to do it, definitely had the temporal resolution. So I moved into biomagnetics, and I was the co-director of the theory part of this group. And between 1994 and 1998, I was running a laboratory in Jülich in Germany at the same time. At that time, there were some very important questions which needed answering. And although we were pretty successful with grants, we had 10 grants alpha rated, not funded in the UK and Europe. And I left everything to go to Japan, because there, people were ready to actually do the things that were needed to do. So before I go any further, I will say something about neurofeedback, which I will only pick up right at the end. Neurofeedback is an exciting modality which we begin to understand very, very sketchily right now, but I believe it has a potential to for use. And in the projects which actually gave rise to some of the results I will do, we're thinking of using this technique for astronauts going to space, and it actually started with astronauts. Again, it's another story which I will go over if anybody's interested in that. It's a family of interventions where the brain receives information about its own status, but information which could be either solid, direct, namely you can actually see the level of alpha activity and you can ask to go up and down, or it's information in the same way that you get information when you learn how to drive, to ride a bicycle, or to ski. So if you try to think about what you are doing, you fail. But the information that comes in all the time to you, the brain somehow deals with all the contingencies and sorts out what the goal is. So I'm thinking of neurofeedback in this mode, in what I would describe right at the end. Practitioners claim that neurofeedback can improve performance or even alleviate a wide range of pathologies. And that sounds very fishy. Okay, when I first learned about neurofeedback, I started feeling a little bit awkward in the 1990s. It was only when I visited Minneapolis, the laboratory of George Georgopoulos, and then they asked me to go for dinner later, but I was already jet lagged, and I said to him, "You will take me back to the hotel, I will sleep, show me something more interesting." And they said, "Yes, we have some people who are living in the forest, veterans from the Vietnam War, and these people bring them back to society." So immediately clicked about something I read about neurofeedback, so I said, that's what I want to see. I saw what they were doing. I understood what they were doing, so I understood what nobody. I felt as confused as everybody else with neurofeedback, but I could see that there was something there worth exploring. But the situation was that it did not have a nice name because of this claim that something which seems to cure lots of strange things together doesn't look right. But I will come to it right at the end in order to show why it's an important technique which has a lot of future. So there are two distinct types of neurofeedback: targeting specific goals, specific frequencies in specific parts of the brain, or targeting the base mechanism, left-right hemisphere balance, for example, the knowledge of your body and the knowledge of your body in space. And claims of improvement in a wide range of conditions usually comes from this category here. And again, at the end of the talk, I will be in a position to tell you why this technique might have some, what is this likely scientific basis. So going back to the main story, the key question at the start of the new millennium for me were whether or not there is any functional imaging modality or any combination of functional imaging modalities that can actually allow us to see into the mosaic of dances that happen into the brain, into how the brain actually functions. And at that time, I felt that the only way to do that is to do some experiments that could not be done in Europe. Namely, we have to have improved fMRI capability in order to actually have accurate gold standard to go on, because the question which everybody was asking is, what is the resolution of this technique? How accurately can you localize? And I was saying it's definitely better than 1 centimeter, which was considered impossible at the time, but I don't know how much. In order to do that, we needed the gold standard. Mathematically, I could show that it was accurate by doing model calculations, but because of the non-uniqueness, that was not enough. So I gave both of them to go to Riken. It was a fantastic environment. We were talking a minute ago, the colleague who actually visited Riken at the time. And this empty space here was where the new Brain Science Institute was located. That's where the new laboratory was going to be. So going to a new laboratory, having the opportunity to set up a new laboratory, I wanted to do a new experiment which would tell us something very new about neuroscience. And I read everything I could read about things on the fringes of what was possible. And I made my mind only after reading the book, The Paradox of Sleep by Michel Jouvet, in which, among other things, he said, we observed that dreaming was neither sleeping nor waking. The problem with oniric activity is a phenomenon without function, rare in physiology. So you become incapacitated. You are not aware of your environment. You are vulnerable in a situation where life and death is the order of the day. You must be doing something important. So I felt that with MEG you could do it. And the other thing which I read, which fascinated me in that book, is that as soon as neurogenesis stops, when the embryo becomes a baby, then paradoxical sleep appears. So sleep has something to do with the thing when neurogenesis stops. And it's accompanied by a range of apparently aimless facial expressions. The idea of a program emerges for psychological hereditary. Remember these words. They're wise words, which I did not fully understand at the time, but after coming back to Cyprus and doing the analysis of the sleep data, those were of extreme importance to me. But the thing which made me decide to do sleep experiments as the first, the real experiment to emphasize that weekend was the dreamer's dream of Jouvet. I read in his book, the majority of researchers are waiting with bated breath for the results of studies combining positron emission tomography scanning, functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, magnetoencephalography, and tomographic electroencephalography. The physiologist's dream may become reality to see the brain working in real time during waking, during sleep, during dreams, daydreams, even lucid dreaming. And I said to myself, yes, PET cannot do it, fMRI cannot do it, EEG, you have to have a very accurate model of the head, which was impossible at the time, but maybe MEG can do it. So that's what we would do at RIKEN. And actually, we bought the system, we asked the company to do modifications in order to allow us to do the first whole night MEG experiments of sleep. And the other thing that Jouvet said at the time, which is very important for this talk, is that what's happening during paradoxical sleep, REM sleep, we'll come to in a minute what exactly this means, is the genetic programs periodically reinforced in order to maintain the functional synaptic circuits responsible for psychological heredity. The advantage of that is that it is the establishment of any circuits that have been altered by events not under direct genetic control. As Jouvet says, my hypothesis is that this genetic reprogramming occurs during paradoxical sleep, that is during dreaming. Not quite. There are problems with this statement, as I realized later, but he was right on the spot. I mean, it was an incisive statement at the time, and that set the goal for what I wanted to do at the time. At the time where we went to RIKEN and decided to do the sleep experiments, there were a number of open questions. The first one that you had to address is what is the localization accuracy of MEG? You could only address sleep after you address this question. Only after this address, we could actually go to sleep. Once we did that, the questions which were obvious is, can we record MEG during saccades? Because, especially during REM, that's what's happening. The eyes are moving. Can we actually record that? The second one, can we extract information from such an MEG signal? And finally, can subjects even sleep inside the helmet with liquid helium all over them? So, thanks to work with Keiji Tanaka and Kang Cheng, some of you know, we were able to show that the spatial resolution of MEG was of the order of millimeters, 2 or 3 millimeters, and that was the accuracy of the co-registration, how well we knew the location of the head with respect to the sensors. We improved that to 1 millimeter, we repeated, not experiments with fMRI, but we actually showed that we can actually reproduce the data, bringing the same subjects on 3 separate days and get exactly the same results, starting everything from scratch, the measurements, and everything else. And we can actually have millisecond resolution. At about the same time, I also addressed the question, what's in the brain, which is the interesting scale in time. And as I was leaving the Jülich place, Carl Zilles was coming along. And I was fascinated by the work of Carl Zilles, defining the side of the tectonic areas of the brain. And it looked to me that that was the significant scale. You should be able to go within the side of the tectonic areas, which is a few millimeters one from the other. So you needed an accuracy of a few millimeters and an accuracy of milliseconds, because it takes 3 to 8 milliseconds to go from one to another. If you had that, then you can understand how the brain functions. It might take you a century, but you had the basis for actually doing it. So what about all the other questions that we had? Yes, we could record during saccades. Yes, we can extract information from such an MEG signal, and you see the examples of that. And can subjects sleep with their head inside the MEG helmet? Yes, even I, who have very bad sleep and I did not pass the classification, the criteria for being a subject, I could actually sleep. I was coming jet lag from journeys, and we postponed the experiment 3 times, because before I put anybody else in the scanner, I want to be a subject and make sure that it's safe and something useful will come out of it. And it was only after that that we actually went through and done the experiments. The other problem I had is that I knew that sleep experiments were difficult in general. Now imagine having to do the first experiment with MEG, so knowing nothing about sleep. So I asked my good friends Sunao Ishida, Maria Corsica-Cabrera from Mexico, and George Kostopoulos, that some of you know very well, to come for 2 weeks to Riken, all expenses paid, and just teach me how to do an MEG experiment which could pass from any top laboratory as a good experiment, any top sleep laboratory. So that was the objective. It's no point going through all this trouble to do an experiment if the sleep expert would tell you, look, this is rubbish, you've done it wrong. And that was the best investment I made in my life. Those 2 weeks with these wonderful people. The only problem was that each one promised to send me 3 PhD students and to have 1 PhD each that I could supervise, but we only had Maria Corsica-Cabrera send us 1 student, a wonderful girl then Yolanda, who actually done the experiments on eye movements in awake state and sleep. So the building was built, the laboratory was made, and we started doing the experiments. So this is the results of the work with Kang Cheng and Keiji Tanaka, in which they done the 2 fMRI experiments, 3 fMRI, 1 to identify subjects with very flat part of the visual cortex, primary visual cortex, where you could actually place 5 slices in order to capture all the V1 that you were interested in. Then they done retinotopic mapping. Then they done ocular dominance columns that they can actually get millimeter accuracy. And then they identify for every part of the visual field where is the best optimal way to place the sensor, to place the activity in order to produce something in primary visual cortex. What you see in the picture, the blue outline is the fMRI results with the 4 Tesla machine after we did the corrections because of the distortions in the images. And what you see in the yellow line is the boundary of the activity from the MEG results, when we have the accuracy by comparing a few milliseconds of activity with the pre-stimulus period of p less than 0.05 after multiple bufferonic correction, and the red one for p001, very high statistics. For every millisecond, pushing it along, you get the first activation around 40 to 45 milliseconds, lasting for only a couple of milliseconds before it disappears. And when I saw this picture, I thought I made a mistake and I put some fMRI things together. But no, because if you compare the red and the blue, you see they almost overlap each other. And the maximum of the MEG, the maximum of the MEG statistical power, you get that at the red point. So we had a resolution of the order of a few millimeters. We could identify the activity inside architectonic areas. What about deep sources? We couldn't do the fMRI experiments because we had to do shimming and other things, and the fMRI laboratory was not to validate MEG. So we use eye movements, and you have eye movements to the left, to the right, and up and down, and we found the activity from the chemomotor nuclei at the correct location, as we know from monkey experiments. So we knew that as we knew from the theoretical calculations, we can actually localize with extreme accuracy throughout the whole of the brain, except right at the center of the head, where for reasons of physics, this was not feasible. So we did the experiments with sleep. We published one paper on sleep, and then we moved to other things about the visual system, music, auditory, somatosensory experiments. And when I came back to Cyprus, we had only this one paper, and we had the questions which were addressing at the time is what correlates with the sleep architecture and so stereotypically repeats every night, as you will see in a minute. What is the ground state on which normal sleep evolves every evening? We had no idea at the time. The question was not even in our minds. Can we understand the evolution within and across sleep stages in normal sleep? Some vague ideas. Can we say something about the contribution of sleep in pathology? No idea at the time, but now this question is very much one of the goals since the beginning of the new laboratory in Cyprus. Now, in order to explain these statements, I need to go back and say something about sleep and the history of sleep, and how sleep is analyzed. The problem in the history of sleep is an old conundrum. For thousands of years, ever since we had language and communicate with each other, we wonder about sleep and make all sorts of hypotheses about sleep. Sleep is an enigma wrapped in mystery for as long as human existed. Only at the beginning of the last century, with the invention of EEG, electroencephalogram, we began to actually get some handle to study sleep. And the major revolution came in the 50s. In the early 50s were the first experiments, which culminated in the definition of sleep stages, a way of characterizing sleep through the large graph elements of sleep. The hypnogram, the ability to describe the whole night of sleep as a graph, is the basis of sleep science and also for sleep medicine. So what do you mean by that? Sleep was divided into 5 stages, 4 stages of sleep, plus the rapid eye movement sleep, where you can dream. Light sleep is stages 1 and 2. Deep sleep, stages 3 and 4 in the classical classification, and REM. And what you do simplistically, you have a sleep onset period where you fall asleep, a very remarkable period that we're studying very closely now. Then you go into sleep stage 1, sleep stage 2, 3 and 4, and then you go up into REM, and the process repeats itself in 3 to 5 cycles every evening. There is something very regular. The thing which strikes me from reading about sleep and looking at diagrams like that is that this regularity begs explanation. We cannot have something so regular. The question you immediately ask is, how do you know which sleep stage you are? Well, you know by looking at the EEG. And what do? You look at the large signals. So classical sleep staging relies on the identification of the hallmarks of each sleep stage. These are either highly rhythmic events, so when you do filtering, they stand out from the background, or they're very large events. And this, remember, we were talking about the 60s, this had to be seen in the EEG that you could actually record at the time. And for the most lengthy period of sleep, this non-REM 2, you have the K complex in the sleep indus as the prototype graph elements. This is one of the largest, the K complex is one of the largest graph elements that you see in normal physiological brain. The sleep indus is a very regular rhythmic occurrence. So for many years, decades, researchers tried to provide a description of each hallmark. We did the same thing at Riken. We tried to do it. We knew we had the tomography. We could see for every single K complex, every spindle, what was happening. But there was no order. It was completely messy. So we didn't publish it. We didn't publish it. 2 years' work, and we were in the middle. I was sitting in my office looking at the thunderstorm. I like looking at the lightning and the thing. And suddenly I said to myself, wait a minute, if I want to understand how a thunderstorm is formed, the last thing I want to do is to look at chaos, to look at the point where the instability collapses, you get a chaotic event and then you go back to equilibrium. I need to look at the equilibrium. So also, I was a little bit depressed by looking at how the field of sleep was progressing. People were trying to simplify sleep and trying to actually make experts agree with each other. But our understanding was that we did not understand sleep. We relied on a technology which depended on the large graph elements that we could detect in the 60s, where we had the beginning of PET, fMRI, and MEG now tomography, which we did not take into account any of that. What the sleep staging was actually progressing was the opposite way. Simplify, so you get rid of the difficult things that you have to justify, and try to express to agree with each other. So the deep sleep, rather than having N3, non-REM 3 and non-REM 4, now had the new sleep stage 3, which encompasses both of them. And again, the graph elements define the activity. Then when you look at now from a database, when you have more than one expert and they agree with each other by consensus, namely they agree with each other until they agree, you find that they agree more or less, but that's not quite right. It's not, it can't be the full picture. So the agreement between sleep raiders, yes?
What kind of subjects is that? What ages, what genders?
These were normal subjects. Normal subjects. These 10 subjects were normal subjects, and you can even design an algorithm to actually reproduce the expert's opinion. Okay, they're very, very good. But what you're doing, you are not reproducing something which is absolute. You're reproducing the impression that these people have in interpreting the guidelines of how to sleep stage. That's my point. You remove yourself from the true neurophysiology when you do sleep staging in order to make experts agree with each other by verifying percentage of graph elements that you see. For example, if you look at the first stage of sleep, you find things which are not quite the same. First of all, things do not go normally. You jump between stage. And when we done the tomography of spindles, for example, here you see the signal how it is, and then you see if you spindles, you see now you expand the spindles, you do the tomography millisecond by millisecond, and you actually repeat and you look at the tomography at the extrema of the EEG distribution, you find that you don't get anything reproducible from one spindle to another. The activity in the brain is somewhere completely different. So what you are seeing during spindles is really like the lightning, which never strikes twice the same place. Okay, it's very different in each one. It doesn't make sense to classify sleep only from that. So the sleep staging sequence is a paradox. Neither the big graph elements nor any of the usual definitions provide a progression from wake to light sleep to deep sleep and then to REM. The big events are highly variable. Paradoxical sleep does not fit into sequence. Maybe the key is not the big events, but then what is left to hang our models? If we cannot rely on the large events, what do you do? Any ideas? Anybody?
The aperiodic low amplitude mixed frequency activity.
Yes, but I put it another way. The fundamental flow is the classical sleep staging is now apparent. It relies on chaotic events and provides no obvious physiological explanation for the irregularities. So the way forward, here you have a K complex. We can analyze this, we can see the activity, we can go to another K complex, it's different. But that's the chaotic event where you go out of equilibrium, and then you go back into these quiet periods. So I said to George Kostopoulos and Peter Fennick, who were working at the time, I said to them, look, let's go and look at these quiet periods. And the answer was, of course, but that's noise. What do you want to amplify noise? The brain does not produce noise. If I learned one thing by doing MEG, is that I trust my signal. I do the cleaning and I trust my signal. So if you have these events, and these events define that I'm non-REM 2, then I have a quiet period for some time. Then these events repeat themselves. And for a long period, I have non-REM 2 stage. It means that the time in between is really the foundation. So I'm a physicist. If I want to study the atom, the last thing I want to do is to bombard with all sorts of different radiations, excited, get all the electrons out of the atom, and see them coming back together, some of them falling back into plane. That's not how you do it. You look at the quiet period, you look at the ground state. If you understand the ground state, Then you understand what is happening. So that was my motivation. And despite the objections from every neurophysiologist I talked to at the time that this is noise, we actually started comparing the different states, the quiet periods of each sleep stage. And lo and behold, for the first time, we see something which changed consistently from awake state, non-REM 1, non-REM 2, deep state, and then finally REM. You have an activation, a small activation, you don't even see it here, the small yellow part, which increases at the front, at the back of the head, and then really explodes in REM, much, much higher than anything you see in the awake state. In those two areas, on the left side of the midline of right-handed male individuals. We haven't done this the question before about gender. We really need to do it for left-handed people. We really need to do it for male and females in order to be sure. But that's the first time we saw something which changed progressively from light to deep sleep to REM. And you can see that the effect is not small. This is common across the 4 subjects that we had with P401, less than P01. This is something very, very highly significant, higher significance than anything I've seen with MEG in evoked responses. I mean, sleep is based on evolution, so this was a very significant event. Now, when you look at these images, what you begin to think about at that time is, what, anybody? What does the location of those look like? What very modern system of the brain everybody's talking about? It's called the default mode network, the network that becomes active when you are not engaged with the environment. So it's a kind of a default state. So I asked a wonderful assistant I had, who was a linguist actually. We were talking about this before about decrease and so on. Give her any task, she would do it properly. She went through the literature, found all the data with localizations, and actually we put everything together. So what you see on this diagram, you see the outline, the white outline, the areas that we have identified at the front and the back of the head for sleep. And around them, you see the theory of mind areas when you are asked to go into the mind of somebody else and imagine how they think, to have some autobiographical memory. And further away, the other default mode network. But if you look very closely, nothing comes into those areas. Nothing. It's an empty place. Which in no study would goes in. You can see it most clearly, for example, let's take this area. You see those yellow and orange, they are at the center of this activity. But if you look from the other views, you see that they are on either side of they're not inside. So here we have the default mode network, the two elements, and at the center of that, we have something which has nothing. And it wakes up when you are asleep. What could that be? We finished this paper by saying, I think I have it in the next slide. So what is represented at the center of the default mode grows? What you find, what we said is that maybe this is something which allows us to go through the night and stay the same. That's what the statement that we made in 2009. But in order to explore it more, now that we had the ground state, now that we knew that by looking at the ground state, we can see the continuity in sleep, the obvious thing to do is to go to the last graph elements, but not look at the last graph elements, look at the time just before. So we did exactly the same trick. We took 2 seconds before the last graph elements and compare that not with the awake state as we did before between the states, but we compare it with the core period of the same sleep stage. So asking the question, okay, this is my ground state. How does it go to the big graph elements? In this way, we identify the generators that we published in a paper in 2017 with George Kostopoulos and Lichan and Vaki Bogosian. And again, in 2019, we identify what generates the spindles, what are the activities which precede spindles and K complexes. Now, this is the panoramic view of what's happening throughout sleep. What you see on the vertical axis, you see the different frequencies. You start from the delta, very low frequencies, theta, alpha, and then you compare each stage with the awake state. Okay, the eyes closed before sleep. Then stage 2 with awake state. And here you compare what's happening in core state period 1 with non-REM 1. So we're asking the question, what happens when you first go to sleep? What I want you to concentrate for the purpose of this lecture is that you see this increase in low activity. So you lose consciousness. You have an active inhibition in the dorsal part of the brain. When you go from non-REM 2 to the core, you have an increase in this activity. When you compare the two together, you have something very interesting happening. You have the areas which were going along the attention system here, the rostral anterior cingulate, increasing activity. That makes sense. Something happened and you lose contact with the environment. What's the next thing you have to do? You have to get the alarming system, the sentinel, up and running. You have to be aware of what's happening in the environment. See, those small things tell me something very important. Tell me that when I go into the second not rapid eye movement, I have to keep note of what's happening in the environment. But then what happens before spindles? Before spindles, we have low frequencies at the same areas. So low frequencies delta activity means inhibition. We shut them down. Why? And then you have activation during spindles. You have activations just in front of the areas we found before and at the back of the head. So let me just do it a little bit differently. Here we have the core state comparisons for stage 1 and 2. Here we have the activity between the increases in non-REM 2. We have increases in the rostral anterior cingulate, the attentional system wakes up, and you have even higher frequencies activation at the front and the back, very close to where we've seen the activity in the increases in the gamma band before. Okay, let me just go through in one picture, try to say the same thing again in a different way. We get increase in the low activities to begin with the delta activity. We have changes between the core and the quiet periods, and then the white one are there as you've seen before in the separate columns of the comparison of the spindles. You have before you have the increases between non-REM 2 and non-REM 1. And then during spindles, you have this suppressed before something happens which relates to spindles. Get the point? And there is an organization which is definite. And that when you look at the K complex, you find that this area here is the only area which generates spindles, which we had the collaboration of Kostopoulos and Christos, who actually recovered with Loretta exactly the same areas. Okay, so the attention monitoring system wakes up here between non-REM 2 and non-REM 1. You get the environment, and a bit later on, you have active inhibition in the same areas here, delta band, and then you have your activation at the back of the head during spindles, very close to the areas you've seen before. So now it begins to, and then when you look further down, you can see the hippocampus and the memory consolidation part, which I don't want to emphasize right now. So what you have now, you have in the midline areas something which relates these things we found the increase of sleep, and you have something which has some order, and you have to make sense of what this order is. We know that spindles are for memory consolidation. We know that for many, we have this evidence for many people together. One of the most recent words, fastly spindles to extend the hippocampal interactions, cortical assemblies come to represent more integrated or overlapping memory traces that prioritize commonalities across related memories. What does that sound to you? It's something which relates to the core elements of ourselves. And remember what Juvet said, as soon as neurogenesis stops, paradoxical sleep appears, with strange facial expressions. But I want to, and Juve said the genetic programs periodically reinforce themselves, so you have some return to our genetic self. But what is genetic self? That doesn't make sense because there is no genetic self. So in this paper, I put the theory together of the new representation of self. What really is happening, what is maintained, is the optimal epigenetic self, i.e. the dynamic, continuously but minimally updated that matches the genetic opportunities to the situational needs that happen every day. Memory consolidation during sleep is not about mundane events. Mundane events, you can see a red apple and you say tomorrow is going to be ripe. You don't need sleep to actually reinforce that memory. You remember that. But if you try to cross the road and you're nearly killed, that memory cannot be consolidated there and then. If it is consolidated there and then, everything around it will come together with that memory. The hippocampus needs to absorb the importance, make it neutral, and put it safely into memory. So that's what sleep is doing. And you see now what the logic is. The tentative square speculation was already provided in the concluding paper, as I said before. The location of the leftmost medial prefrontal cortex, where the tonic REM area as a distinct center of the medial prefrontal cortex, surrounded by the theory of mind and the default mode system, is a candidate hub for the network supporting the continuity of self-identity in both sleeping and waking. So our 209 statement was spot on. It's the neural representation of self that is two hubs. One, the executive part at the front, which makes the decisions, and the memory part at the back of the head. So during sleep, our self wakes up. When you wake up in the morning, it goes to sleep. Why? Because when you wake up in the morning, what you have to do is interact with the environment. The neural representation of self must not be changed. If you try to do that while you are awake, then the dramatic events are going to kill you. You won't be the same person. You cannot be the same person. Everything else will collapse and you become pathological. But if anybody's interested in epilepsy, that relates to epilepsy. In our background, we were life and death situation every day. We had to become epileptic to survive. We have to fight as if there was no tomorrow. That's what remains. That's what epilepsy is in my mind. So I can explain most of the pathologies during this idea. We can explain addiction. The reward system occupies everything that's important. Nothing else can compete during sleep. Sleep cannot do its work. Now you can see neurofeedback might have something to do with that. So the neurorepresentation of self, the identity and intent must be protected. It must be handled with caution and precision. Memory consolidation of salient events must be done in a special safe environments. You go to sleep, you lose consciousness, you are not affected by the environment. Non-REM 2 comes up, the sentinel wakes up, makes sure everything is safe, and then it's shut down. Then the spindles can come up and change the dramatic events, put them back in place in order to modify the epigenetic self, which has to be modified in order to, the next day to be able to deal with the dramatic events that happened the day before. So the changes are integrated before we wake up. And in my mind, the REM period is the period where the brain plays scenarios of what might happen the next day, extraordinary scenarios, random associations in this new self, so that it's ready for action the next day. So the big question, Juve was partially right. With the information he had in the 50s, he was right. Sleep returns the individual back to something like the genetic self. The problem is that there is no genetic self. The genes provide potentialities. They do not provide hard reality. Hard reality is through experience. So the only thing I can return to is the optimal self. The optimal self of the environment we found ourselves. So since there is no fixed genetic self, what needs to be maintained is a consistent new representation of self that is optimal for addressing the needs of an ever-changing and often hostile environment. Its origins can be traced to the need to move safely in space. Okay, you need to be able to interact in the environment. You need to be able to actually report, and this is a separate system. The new representation of self must fall asleep when you wake up. Its servants, which have been trained during the night, what to do during the day, take over. So this, in my mind, is what sleep is doing. Predictions. The new representation must be formed early in life, starting in the womb and becoming autonomous slowly in the first weeks, months of life. The self must be protected from the vagaries of our state because its core representation must be preserved. A failure to do so will lead to pathology. If you wake up the next morning and you behave differently as a different person, your wife behaves differently, you might find it exciting, but no society will survive that. Okay. It's very important to maintain the new representation of self the same, as much as is possible, given the contingencies of the environment in your previous life. Failure to do so is pathology. I went through the literature and found out, different cases. You see, they talk in terms of the default mode network being formed. Okay, but you see what is formed is really the centers that you have identified. This is our results here, and this is how it grows, the other stage. It's not the whole of the default mode network. What is actually generated is that. So the tentative hypothesis is that the new representation related to the concept of self that we label as midline self-representation core with the new representation of self is something that is generated. Now, what is all this for? To preserve the NRS and the link between our distant past and recent events. Evolution has given us the genetics of the potentialities which are feasible. That assures consistency and continuity of self-identity, the pillars and logic of our existence, while making the necessary, absolutely necessary changes to the new representation of self to guide future action. So what is the status of the key questions we started with? Can we find something in the brain that correlates with the regularity of sleep stages? Yes, we can. This midnight representation, which actually later came to recognize as the new representation of self. What is the ground state on which normal sleep evolves every evening? Can we understand the evolution within and across sleep stages in normal sleep? The answer to that is probably the core state is the ground state. That's what we need to study. And then we can understand the evolution by going from the ground state to the period before the graph of elements to understand. Can we make something about the contribution of sleep to pathology? That's the whole program of research that we are now trying to get funding to support to actually make these ideas true. And I'm happy to talk about different pathologies and our interpretation of them. So I would not say something, I rephrase what I said in terms of the ideas of Vygotsky and Piaget, how the developments of life. Your feedback is about the new representation of self. I'll come to it in a minute. Why evolution has put self mechanisms to ensure minimal changes only when necessary, because any changes with irrelevant parts coming in are going to destroy us. If you have a dramatic event and you don't separate what is safe and you put that into a neutral, non-dangerous case, it will harm you forever. Post-traumatic stress is precisely that. Does the new representation of self relates to addiction? Yes, it's a hijacking of the reward system. If yes, how can we use smoking cessation? We're trying to publish the paper because we have too few subjects and you have to do a new mathematics, what I was talking to Vasilis earlier. So there are distinct roles for awake state of sleep. While you are awake, our priority is to stay alive. And you stay alive by avoiding danger, making partners to continue the species, and very recently to leave the imprint to our progeny. And most of our pathologies comes because leaving an imprint to the pathology requires the self to stay the same, to create art and to create all the nice things. We sleep to integrate our experiences in our memories and adapt accordingly and sparingly for the new representation of self. What captures our attention, or what we pay attention to, is what sleep consolidates memory for future use. In a way, the I and the others, the next morning, must see the same person as they see in the morning before. The mystery is how go out like zombies tired in the evening and wake up ourselves as we were the previous morning with small changes, maybe a nightmare or a nice dream. So what about neurofeedback? Remember the two stages we said? I want to talk about the latest stage, which looks like magic. Okay, so the mystification of neurofeedback is that can it be something which actually can cure all these things? You go in with all sorts of different conditions, you do these general things, which doesn't have to be neurofeedback. It has to be control your heart rate or something very similar, the large systems. And then suddenly, symptoms which seem totally unrelated disappear. How can that happen? Remember also what Juve has said, as soon as neurogenesis stops, true paradoxical sleep appears, accompanied by a range of apparently aimless facial expressions. The idea of a program engages psychological heredity. Well, for me, neurofeedback does what the mother does to a baby. It's exactly the same route, at least those general things. What does a mom do to the baby? Early in life, the mother does something remarkable. It doesn't need MEG, it doesn't need fMRI. It looks at the facial expressions as they change from the child, and it responds in what my friend Colin Terwante in Edinburgh says, a musicality of the interaction between mother and child. There is an interchange. Remember, US says all these random facial expressions. The mother hones that into something meaningful and consistent. It does neurofeedback. It does exactly the same thing. It takes the contingencies, like we learn how to ride a bicycle. It makes the emotional state of the child normal. What other people in society will recognize the smile as something uniform. Because it forms these facial expressions are an expression of the new representation of self. Neurofeedback and other methods introduced over the years can play mom's role when problems emerge later in life and sleep cannot do its role. So in my mind, when I do neurofeedback, I'm not doing anything. I'm not changing anything in the brain. I'm just nudging the brain away from bad frequencies, away from bad habits, and then I bring a condition, a new experience for this subject, which sleep would take over, take the natural mechanism that it was evolved to actually perform and solve the problems. That's why the deep problems can be attacked by just changing the very basic structures, the very low frequencies, infra-low frequencies neurofeedback, or by controlling your heart rate. If you're addicted and you have nothing else but getting the drug, because that bypasses all the efforts that you do, and there is nothing left for the sleep to do. You introduce something which affects the systems in a controllable way, in the way the evolution has done, the sleep takes over. So when I do something on neurofeedback, I'm not doing anything. I'm just nudging for sleep to take over and do the same thing. And some of the people that I need to thank is Dr. Vlache Bogosian, who was with me at RIC and actually came with my wife, Dr. Licha Liu, to set up the laboratory in Cyprus, with me at RIC also, and Dr. Panagiotis Pamidis, who was one of my first PhD students, George Kostopoulos, that some of you know, that was with me in most of the adventures on sleep. And of course, Professor John J. Taylor, that we proved together why the magnetic field tomography I developed back in 1988 is the technique which allows us to do this tomographic analysis, which gave rise to the results I described. And Dr. Peter Fennick, who is I don't know if anybody knows Peter Fennick. He's a fantastic neuropsychiatrist, an open mind, joyful person, and a hero like me, who this chronological age is close to 90 now. So which you had a lot of nice time together in Japan and in Cyprus when I came to visit a few times. Before I thank you for your presence, I'd like to make an advertisement. The Cyprus Research and Innovation Foundation is offering some internships on the summer, and there are bike companies participating. So if anybody found something interesting here and they want to do some work with us in the summer, you can actually find it in this website here. The main objective is to bring promising scientists, graduate people doing their undergraduate or graduate degrees. They can come for 30 working days. They are paid 1,400 euros for their time, and they can work in the laboratory or anything like that. So have a look at this website, and then if you find something interesting, just find our company or anybody else that you like and apply. And also, we work very closely astrophysical, so one of my first lab, and I should have chosen astrophysical and nuclear physics at the time, but I had a good basketball team at Surrey, so I stayed at Surrey rather than going to Oxford and do astrophysics. But I follow what's happening nowadays in astrophysics with my good friend Andreas, the director of European University Cyprus, and we have some collaborative projects that we look at in graph theory results, the same mathematics looking at astrophysical events and neuroscience. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready for your questions.
Any questions?
Yeah.
I was very interested in what you were saying about the pathology